I'm Bonnie Glaser, Managing Director of the Indo-Pacific Program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Welcome to the China Global Podcast. In China's 14th five-year plan that spans from 2021 to 2025, priority was assigned to development of emerging technologies that could be both disruptive and foundational for the future. China is now a global leader in AI technology and is poised to overtake the West and become the world leader in AI in the years ahead, or at least they hope so. Importantly, there's growing evidence that AI-enabled military capabilities are becoming increasingly central to Chinese military concepts for fighting future wars. A recently released report provides insights on Chinese perspectives on military uses of AI. Published by Georgetown's Center for Security and Emerging Technology, known as CSET, the report illustrates some of the key challenges Chinese defense experts have identified in developing and fielding AI-related technologies and capabilities. I'm delighted to host the author of the report today, Sam Bresnick, who's a research fellow at Georgetown CSET, and he focuses on AI applications and Chinese technology policy. Welcome to the China Global Podcast, Sam.
Thanks, Bonnie, for having me. Thrilled to be here.
So first, can you explain why you wrote this report? There's obviously many things that have been written about Chinese policy about AI, but you focused on what the Chinese themselves have written about. So what got you interested in that?
Yeah, so a few years ago, there were a flurry of articles in the Western press basically making the claim that China was overtaking the United States in, developing and fielding AI and related emerging technologies for military uses. And essentially, these articles all made the same claim that, China's centralized governance structure and political system gave them an advantage in basically identifying technologies and then making, the government apparatus and even private sector enterprises develop and then use these technologies. And, I thought this was an interesting insight or series of insights, but I found that it generally ignored what the Chinese themselves were saying about both, how Chinese capabilities matched up with those of the United States, as well as how Chinese experts viewed China's own capabilities. And so what I decided to do was use CNKI, which is, a repository of Chinese academic writing, and basically use a selection of dozens of articles published between 2020 and 2022 using a paired keyword search methodology that helped me identify articles that dealt with the future of warfare and AI. And after reading these articles, I thought I could basically write this report that I ended up writing, identifying where China both viewed itself in terms of developing and fielding militarily relevant AI systems themselves, and also, how those systems compared with the United States.
So what is China's assessment of the impact of AI and related emerging technologies on future military capabilities? What are the risks that they see, and how worried are they about these risks?
Yeah, so on the first part of that question, a lot has been written about it. It's essentially boils down to China views AI as a foundational aspect of their military modernization going forward. China has this idea that they are now capable of fighting what they call informatized or informationized wars, that basically they depend on information technology to make decisions, inform targeting, and basically run their military operations with information technology. The next step of this is what they call intelligentization, which is the use of AI and related emerging technologies. And so they believe that intelligentized warfare will be defined by, increasing speed of operations. The tempo of strikes will increase, that the strikes will become more precise. There will be more autonomy on future battlefields, and that, AI systems will help inform decision making. And they think that this, the country that develops AI-enabled military systems faster and better than other countries will have a significant advantage in future wars. And so, because because the Chinese government essentially has identified this as an important step forward, you have a huge amount of investment in AI and related emerging technologies to essentially overtake the United States military in warfighting capacity. Now, this approach is not without risks. There is a lot of discussion in the West about how China might have different views of AI-related risks, as well as, some people have the view that they don't actually care about risks as much as we do. The United States Department of Defense has released several documents outlining risks and how to mitigate them. What I found in this research is actually that a lot of Chinese scholars are very cognizant of AI-related risks and recommend several approaches to mitigating them. One of the big risks that they mention, right, is sort of lack of explainability and trustworthiness of AI systems, right? You don't know how these AI systems are making decisions. You don't know how much you can trust them. And so the use of them could essentially lead to escalations, accidents, and mistakes that could lead to the outbreaks and escalation of wars. Another, couple of risks are the targeting of friendly forces from AI systems, right? And then even the targeting of civilians. So this report, I tried to outline as much as possible, that within Chinese military academic circles and in military circles, there are discussions of risks that are occurring.
So in your research, did you detect significant differences among Chinese experts in their views, either on risks or other aspects of AI and its military applications? And did you identify any areas of debate?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. In general, I would say the vast majority, even almost 100% of the articles I read were very optimistic about AI being really important for future military operations. Two interesting, debates. I don't know if I would call them debates, but perhaps differences when reading, between the lines here. There's a bit of a debate about whether China should go for the exquisite or go for mass, right? And what I mean by that is, in the United States, our military has prioritized exquisite systems, right? The best of the best, very expensive platforms, F-35s, aircraft carriers being examples of those where you think you have a quality advantage, right? You spend so much money and time and developing these things, you think they will give you big advantages on future battlefields. Whereas China has they've gotten a lot better at quality, but where they really excel is quantity. They now have more, missiles and a lot of military platforms than we have. And so there is a bit of an implicit debate going on in China with regard to AI and emerging technologies, whether they should really aim to push the quality forward or get to good enough quality and make up for that difference in quality potentially with us with more of them, with mass. So this is one example. And, drones are an excellent example of this, right? China has a big advantage in manufacturing capacity, right? So there's a thought among some scholars in China that China doesn't necessarily need to have the best drone software or AI, but can make up for that with just overwhelming numbers of these things. Another interesting debate that, again, reading between the lines, is basically a debate over the Chinese military cultural system. I should say the Chinese military culture, bureaucracy, political culture, and essentially does the Chinese military system allow for the best use of AI? And what I mean by that is, China has a very hierarchical, very bureaucratic military. It doesn't often allow younger, more junior officers to make decisions. And so there are some people writing in China about the need to reform decision-making cycles or processes in order to take full advantage of AI and related emerging technologies. So these are two debates. I wouldn't necessarily call them explicit. They're sort of taking place, implicitly between the lines here, but I think are important for thinking about how China approaches AI and related emerging technologies going forward.
What is the evidence in open source that shows that China's been making progress in the military application of AI?
So there are a number of data sources here. A big one is simply Chinese media, right? PLA Daily and the South China Morning Post, for example, will often write about quote unquote breakthroughs in military technologies, right? Swarming technologies are a big one. Decision making systems, and then you also have from the Department of Defense, they release a report on China's military advancements every year, and so every year now for the last few years, we've had more and more evidence in those reports of Chinese advances in AI and related emerging technologies. And then you also have random media reports, right, about various things that get reported. For example, right, in the last couple of weeks, we had a report about China's use of I believe it was Meta's open source LLM in using that LLM for military operations or military planning in some way. So there's media reports, right? From where I sit, there's also a good amount of information out there on procurement documents. CSET has done some work on this, using open source procurement documents to look at what the PLA is buying in terms of military relevant AI. And then the final thing I'll say, right, is that again, in academic journals, you'll have computer science, engineering, and then military journals with articles talking about specific algorithms aimed at solving a military problem here, or a certain computer science technique to train drone swarms, for example. So basically across media, across academic publications, and then in open source, documents or open source venues, there's mounting evidence of the importance of AI and China's investment in this. And the last thing I'll say, right, is we also know from Chinese strategic documents about the importance of military-civil fusion. And this is something that continues apace. And essentially, that's the idea that you want to get the public sector and the private sector working on AI-related technologies to basically push forward military modernization. So I would say there's a bunch of evidence. You just need to know where to look for it.
Your report says that there's a notable lack of trust among Chinese experts in the existing capabilities of AI technology. I found that really interesting. So can you elaborate on it?
Yeah. So, the interesting thing about AI right now, right, is everyone is talking about how important it is, but we're often using it in very low stakes scenarios, right? Like you're asking it to summarize an article, you're asking it to generate some talking points. But you have to remember, in military context, these are life and death decisions you're making a lot of the time. And so there is a higher level of trust you need to basically get these systems online. And so while doing this research, I found a lot of Chinese authors, military authors, were writing about the difficulties associated with knowing how AI systems make decisions, right? This is, some people call this the black box problem. You'll give an instruction, and then there will be an output, but you don't know how the system got from A to B. And this is super important because you want to be able to understand how an AI system makes a decision in order to trust that system. So throughout these documents I read, there were, dozens of mentions of lack of explainability, lack of reliability, right? Lack of security, which all impact the trustworthiness of these systems. And again, just to harken back a little bit to an answer I gave previously, the PLA in general is a low trust organization. As we've seen in the last couple of weeks, very high ranking officials can be purged at any time. You don't have, superiors trusting their junior officers. And then you don't necessarily, both of those sides might not trust, the systems themselves. And so I think going forward, that is a big potential stumbling block for the PLA is, can they design systems that they trust enough? And actually also, at what point do you trust a system enough to use it?
Chinese experts have also identified a range of deficiencies that might constrain the development and the implementation of military AI. So can you list a few of those?
Yeah. So These are basically, they range from data issues to cybersecurity to testing and evaluation to standards. And, the full list is obviously in the report, but I'll go through a couple here. To train artificial intelligence systems, you need a lot of data and you need high quality data. And this is an issue in China, even though we hear a lot that China has a data advantage because they have so many people, they have, so many transactions captured digitally. In the military sector, they actually have a lack of data issue because they haven't fought a war in 45 years, right? And so compared to the US, where we have, millions of hours of drone footage from the Middle East, China actually has less militarily relevant data than we do, which makes it difficult to train models, right? They have a smaller selection of data. Beyond that, there is an issue with sharing that data among different branches and services of the PLA, different arms and services of the PLA. There's some stovepiping going on, it appears, where, what the PLA Navy has, it might not share with the PLA Air Force. And then there's also issues with digitizing data. In a really interesting article that appears in my report, one of the authors notes that some naval gun firing data is written down on paper and seldom digitized, right? So even though we think of China as a fully digitized society, the PLA is still having some trouble, it would appear, with fully digitizing its data resources. And then, just finally on data, issues with analyzing the huge amount of information you need, right? Modern warfare generates a huge amount of data from sensors, in the sea, on the land, in air, in space. And so you need to get all of this data together and analyze it quickly. And there's some concern about that. Another thing I'll mention just briefly is standards, right? CSET research has found that China's defense industrial base has become more diffuse over the years. Beijing used to rely on, a handful of SOEs to do most of its military supplying. Now there are really thousands of companies involved in this. And so ensuring that there are standards for AI and related technology development seems to be a challenge, because when you don't have shared standards, you're going to have systems that are developed by different companies that might not talk to each other, right? Or work together in a way that would create inter-system interoperability, which is an important thing going forward. The last thing I'll say, right, is on testing and evaluation. AI systems are relatively nascent technology. I would say we're probably having issues in the United States military, figuring out how to properly test and evaluate some of these systems. I think China's in the same boat, at least according to the articles I read, is, how do you create testing and evaluation procedures that account for all possibilities in future wars, right? Where you have, the fog of battle, you have, electronic warfare. You can't properly, see or understand what's going on. How do you basically mimic those situations in peacetime to train your models or to evaluate your models or systems in a way that guarantees they will work how you want them to in the future? These are all challenges, and I don't think anyone has great ideas right now as to how to fully, solve these issues.
When the Chinese think about how to mitigate AI risks, are they reading the writings of other international experts? Obviously, there's a lot about mitigation of AI risks in literature here in the United States, and I assume elsewhere. And do they advocate international engagement on AI safety? I know that there is an existing dialogue between American experts and Chinese experts on AI, and it's been feeding into some of the policy discussions in Washington, D.C. And of course, we recently saw the signing of an agreement or an understanding between President Biden and Xi Jinping on having humans in the loop on any decision-making in nuclear weapons and not leaving that to AI. And that was something that actually the two governments worked on for several years through Track 2 discussions, and then talked about it in official settings. So how do the Chinese think about mitigating AI risks, and do they even advocate foregoing or curbing some of the potential uses, which I think some Americans advocate that.
Yeah, so there's a lot there. I'll take a few stabs at that. On the first question, are they reading international experts? Absolutely. I would say, American experts are really, I think, at least in the articles I read, the most cited. There are various people, I won't name names, but there are some people who show up all the time in these documents, and you wonder sometimes, are these documents revealing Chinese perspectives, or are they just sort of regurgitating US perspectives and presenting them as their own? Because a lot of times there's a lot of overlap. Sometimes there's not. But that's number one. In terms of risk mitigation, there's sort of technical risk mitigation techniques that they put forward, right? There's a focus on basically coming up with techniques to expand data sets, to use synthetic data, and to sort of try to combine human knowledge with computer systems to try to basically create more data that would allow their systems to work better. There's model training recommendations for trying to get around some of the explainability issues to make these things more explainable, more reliable, more trustworthy, so that you can try to avoid some of the trustworthy, so you can try to avoid some of the unreliability that would lead to potential escalations and risks. Interestingly, right, there's also a lot of talk about, as you mentioned, the need to engage internationally, right? And so I would say something that I found very interesting is the China-US AI dialogue has continued over the last, year or so, year plus, at the same time as the US-China dialogue on nuclear issues has been shut down by the Chinese. And I think this is evidence on some level that China is really taking these issues seriously and is concerned enough about them to, want to basically understand where the US is coming from and try to mitigate risks like this. Now, in general, I would say China is very interested in AI safety, international engagements, with a focus on civilian systems. It's been a little bit less forthcoming in military, like explicitly military forums. It does go to the REAIM summit. It's one of the big countries there. It's involved in the UN, but China hasn't really released that much guidance for military AI that it's, pushing forward or pushing into the international conversation. And so something that I found interesting while I was doing this research was that there seems to be a big appetite within the, defense expert, military AI defense expert zone, if you will, in engaging on these issues to share the Chinese perspective, because there is a sense that the U.S. is really taking the lead here with the political declaration on military AI, for example. And so wanting to sort of, create a channel for China to both, engage here and share its best practices and views on the matter.
What implications can be drawn from discussions on AI risks that are taking place within the Chinese system?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. There's a general take that AI is what they say all the time, that it's a double-edged sword, right? That it creates great opportunities, but that it also, includes great risks. And so, as I mentioned, right, one of the implications, I think, is that it's super interesting that they have continued this AI dialogue with the United States, despite shutting down the one on nuclear issues. This means they're trying again to manage risks with the U.S. to some extent. Another really interesting thing that I think deserves to be talked about a little bit more, and that I've written about a little bit, is that, AI appears to be changing. I shouldn't say that. I should say there are voices in China who believe that AI is going to change, or is already changing, the Chinese approach to deterrence, or I should say should change the Chinese approach to deterrence in and around the South and East China Seas. And this is because essentially the PLA has for a long time had this idea that it's very good at managing escalation and putting a lid on escalation dynamics. And the introduction of AI and related emerging technologies and autonomy could increase the speed at which, decisions get made and escalations happen. And so there's a sense perhaps that this is going to make it more risky for China to basically continue the risky deterrence actions they take, in and around the South and East China Seas. And so one of the implications and one of the things I think the U.S. should discuss with China going forward is how to basically think about how AI changes escalation dynamics or how it impacts escalation dynamics. And is there a way, maybe beyond hotlines, because we've seen those don't work so well sometimes. Are there, norms and rules of the road around that issue that we can, discuss?
I mentioned earlier the Xi Jinping-Biden agreement on maintaining human control over the decision to use nuclear weapons. And you just, I think, brought up a good suggestion that discussions take place on controlling escalation. So those are two good areas. Are there other areas in which you think that the military use of AI should be discussed between the United States and China? Is there anything else that lends itself to an agreement and something that could be tested? Clearly, in the case of keeping humans in the loop on decision-making over nuclear weapons, it's going to look good on paper, but I doubt that we're going to have any on-site verification. So we probably really won't know whether they are complying with it. And hopefully we will never test that. But Are there any other issues that come to mind?
Yeah, no. So just briefly on the nuclear side of things, interestingly, pretty much all of the papers I read noted that the combination of AI and nuclear command control and communications was a bad combination. And so, I think that's a little bit encouraging that within the Chinese, defense sector, there is an idea that, AI and nukes should not be mixed. So I'm hopeful, I agree with you. It's going to be very hard to verify that, but I'm hopeful that their own, the preponderance of evidence, at least that I've seen, would suggest that they don't want to do that. In terms of other areas to explore, one is this escalation dynamics topic that I just mentioned. I think it would be really interesting or useful to talk about both sides' perceptions of AI risks, right? We have a sense of what their ideas are regarding AI risks, but as this technology develops, as both sides really roll out more AI-enabled military systems, are they seeing new risks pop up? Where do we see risks, right? Can we work together on managing those risks? I don't think we're going to get to a point in the near or medium term where we're signing, binding arms control agreements, but I think there is space for the establishment of norms and, understanding how to mitigate risks could be, fertile ground for discussion. Another one, right, would be norms around testing and evaluating AI-enabled military systems, right? As I mentioned before, this is a really new area that both sides, I think, are still learning about. And so sharing best practices, right, about how to test and evaluate these systems could be useful. And then areas that are a bit more sensitive that I'm less hopeful China would be willing to engage on, and I'm not sure how willing, the United States would be willing to engage on. But, there's been a lot of discussion recently about Chinese hacking efforts and penetration of critical infrastructure, right? And the role potentially that AI plays in, cyber defense or cyber offense in these contexts could be an interesting thing to discuss, as well as how AI could impact, space operations is another area here. Those are both very, very sensitive on the Chinese side. I don't really see a huge amount of runway for those, but I think it would be useful to inquire as to whether or not those could be discussed at the Track 1 level, because I do know they are being discussed at the Track 1.5 and Track 2 levels.
Great suggestions. Are there any steps that could be taken unilaterally? I agree with you that signing agreements or anything that sort of smells of arms control, the Chinese are essentially allergic to. And they don't want to be treated like the former Soviet Union. Maybe we will eventually get there, but I'm not terribly optimistic about the short term. Are there any things that could be steps that could be taken unilaterally by both sides that actually could reduce risks?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, again, I think back to this nuclear angle, right, where the U.S. actually came out and said we will not include AI in nuclear decision making. And that was a year or a couple of years ago. And from what I heard from Chinese sources was basically there were two reactions to that. One was saying, "Oh wow, great! The United States, has done this and agrees with this, and we should, consider doing the same." The other was a total lack of trust and an idea that we would, say we're doing that, but then, not actually do that, and then China would be at a disadvantage if it pledged to do that. So, I don't have any great suggestions on unilateral actions. I do think going forward, right, I would hope that that the United States continues to engage Chinese counterparts on these discussions to see, what's possible in this, very tense security environment we're in right now and are, going to be in going forward. But I think, the U.S. focus on responsible use and trustworthiness in AI systems is a good example to set, and hopefully will convince at least some in Beijing that we are not necessarily going to push the envelope to complete military advantage at the expense of AI safety. And I think if we continue to reinforce that, there could be some areas for dialogue and potential action going forward. Again, I agree with you, short of binding arms control agreements.
We've been talking with Sam Bresnick, who is at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, written a great report on Chinese perspectives on military use of AI. So urge all of our listeners to go to Georgetown CSET's website and read the report. Thanks so much for joining the China Global Podcast, Sam.
Thanks so much, Bonnie.